The insight views. Sharper focus. Deeper insight. Uncovering stories, revealing truths. Turning headlines into understanding. Dole Chadee was one of Trinidad and Tobago's most notorious figures. Known for his violent reputation and alleged control over the drug trade in the Caribbean, Chadee's life was a complex story of crime, power, and ultimate downfall. While never convicted of drug-related offenses, his name became synonymous with fear, violence, and criminal enterprise in Trinidad's southern regions. Born in 1951 in Trinidad and Tobago, Dole Chadee, whose real name was Nankissoon Boodram, grew up in the small village of Piparo, an area that would later become infamous as his operational base. Details about his early childhood are sparse, but what is known reflects a modest upbringing in a community often struggling with poverty and limited opportunities. Chadee's early environment likely shaped his understanding of power and survival, and it was within this context that he would eventually rise to notoriety. By the 1980s and 1990s, Trinidad and Tobago, like much of the Caribbean, was facing an influx of illegal drug activity. Cocaine and marijuana were being trafficked through the islands, creating opportunities for those willing to assert control through force and intimidation. Chadee emerged during this era as a figure of considerable influence. Residents of Piparo and surrounding areas reported that he controlled local distribution networks, managed armed associates, and maintained a level of authority that few dared challenge. Though his influence was clear, Chadee's life was not defined solely by drugs. His notoriety was cemented by acts of extreme violence, most notably his involvement in multiple murders. The crime for which he would become most infamous occurred in the mid-1990s, when a series of killings shocked the nation. These acts of violence were brutal and public, and they contributed to a growing climate of fear in the communities under his control. One of the most high-profile cases associated with Chadee was the murder of 4 men, who were reportedly killed for betraying him in matters of loyalty and trust. Authorities allege that Chadee's methods were calculated and merciless, with the intention of sending a clear message to anyone who might oppose him. While some reports suggest these acts were linked to disputes within his alleged drug network, others claim they were personal vendettas carried out with cold precision. Regardless, these murders would eventually lead to his arrest and prosecution. Chadee's arrest marked a turning point in Trinidad and Tobago's efforts to combat organized crime. Law enforcement authorities, working under intense public pressure, investigated Chadee's operations and gathered evidence linking him to multiple killings. He was apprehended in the late 1990s, ending years of a reign that had instilled fear in both the local population and rival criminal element. The trial of Dole Chadee was widely covered by national and international media. It became a focal point for discussions about crime, justice, and the challenges of law enforcement in the Caribbean. The prosecution presented evidence alleging Chadee's direct involvement in the murders, including testimonies from witnesses and survivors who detailed the methods and brutality of his crimes. Chadee's defense argued that much of the evidence was circumstantial, and that while he may have been associated with criminal networks, he should not be held personally responsible for all the acts attributed to him. Despite the defense, the court found Chadee guilty of multiple counts of murder. The sentencing reflected the severity of the crimes and the impact they had on the victims' families and the broader community. Chadee was sentenced to death, a verdict that sparked both support and controversy. Supporters argued that the sentence was necessary to uphold justice and deter future violence, while critics raised questions about the application of capital punishment and the effectiveness of the justice system in addressing organized crime. On January 4, 1999, Dole Chadee was executed by hanging at the Royal Jail in Trinidad. His death marked the end of one of the most violent chapters in the country's criminal history. The execution was carried out under intense security and attracted significant media attention. In the aftermath, authorities emphasized the message that organized crime would not be tolerated, and that even the most feared individuals could be held accountable. Chadee's life and death had a lasting impact on Trinidad and Tobago. His notoriety became a cautionary tale for communities affected by crime and a case study for law enforcement and policymakers. Scholars and criminologists have analyzed his rise and fall to understand the social, economic, and political conditions that allow figures like him to emerge and operate with relative impunity. While Chadee's involvement in drug trafficking was never legally proven, his reputation as a drug lord persisted. Reports from former associates, law enforcement officials, and journalists indicated that he was deeply embedded in the Caribbean's drug networks, managing operations that extended beyond Trinidad. Yet, the inability to secure convictions for drug offenses highlights the complexities of prosecuting organized crime, where fear, loyalty, and corruption can complicate investigations. The Piparo community, once under Chadee's influence, underwent significant changes following his execution. Law enforcement presence increased, and community initiatives aimed at providing alternatives to crime were introduced. For residents, the legacy of Chadee is multifaceted. Some remember him as a figure who brought fear and suffering, while others recall the economic opportunities that arose in his shadow, however morally ambiguous they were. Internationally, Dole Chadee's case attracted attention as part of the broader narrative of Caribbean organized crime. Analysts examined how local actors could gain control over drug trade routes, and how small communities could become epicenters of criminal power. Chadee's ability to evade drug convictions despite widespread suspicion highlights the challenges faced by law enforcement across the region, where evidence is often difficult to obtain, and witness intimidation is common. The story of Dole Chadee also sheds light on the intersection of culture, economics, and criminality. In communities like Piparo, where opportunities for advancement were limited, figures like Chadee could rise to prominence by offering resources, employment, or protection, albeit through criminal means. This dynamic underscores the broader societal factors that contribute to the emergence of organized crime, including poverty, lack of education, and limited state presence. Media portrayals of Chadee varied widely. Local newspapers and television outlets often depicted him as a symbol of terror, emphasizing the violent nature of his crimes and the fear he inspired. International media, meanwhile, framed his story within the larger context of Caribbean drug trafficking, connecting his actions to global networks and the broader challenges of combating organized crime in small island nations. Despite the passage of time, Chadee's name remains in the public consciousness. Documentaries, books, and journalistic accounts continue to explore his life, his operations, and the societal conditions that allowed him to rise to power. For many, his story serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of organized crime and the importance of robust legal systems, community engagement, and preventive measures to reduce the appeal of criminal enterprises. Dole Chadee's case also prompted discussions about the criminal justice system in Trinidad and Tobago. Questions arose regarding the effectiveness of policing, the role of capital punishment, and the ways in which society addresses violent crime. His execution, while concluding his personal story, did not eliminate the structural conditions that enable organized crime, making his legacy a point of reflection for policymakers, law enforcement, and communities alike. In examining the life of Dole Chadee, it becomes clear that his influence extended beyond the immediate sphere of his criminal activities. He became a symbol of fear, power, and the consequences of lawlessness, shaping the lives of countless individuals, and altering the course of communities like Piparo. His story also serves as a lens through which to study the interplay between individual ambition, criminal opportunity, and societal vulnerability. Ultimately, Dole Chadee's life was a tragic narrative of power and violence, marked by criminal ingenuity, brutality, and the inescapable reach of the law. From a small village in Trinidad to the headlines of international media, his story captures the complexities of organized crime in the Caribbean, illustrating how one individual can leave a lasting imprint on both local and national history. Today, Chadee is remembered not just for his crimes, but for what his life represents, the consequences of unchecked ambition, the dangers of criminal networks, and the enduring struggle of communities and nations to confront and overcome organized crime. As Trinidad and Tobago continues to grapple with the challenges of law enforcement and social development, the story of Dole Chadee remains a potent reminder of both the human cost of crime and the relentless pursuit of justice. In conclusion, Dole Chadee's life and death are inseparable from the story of Trinidad and Tobago's battle with organized crime in the late 20th century. His rise, reign, and eventual execution highlight the interplay between opportunity, violence, and the law. While he may never have been convicted of drug offenses, his impact on the Caribbean's criminal landscape and his enduring notoriety ensure that his story continues to captivate, educate, and warn future generations. The Insight Views. Sharper focus. Deeper insight. Uncovering stories, revealing truths. Turning headlines into understanding.